Kootenay West, and I'll briefly talk about him. He's a chiropractor, and his practice is in trail, and he's been a past president of the Trail Roslyn PC Association, and he was elected to the House of Commons in the 1974 election. At present, Bob is a member of several parliamentary committees, one on health, welfare and social affairs, one on fisheries and forestry, as well as Indian affairs and northern development, regional development, and he's the vice chairman of the PC Caucus Committee for Department of Regional Economic Expansion. That's quite a job load, I imagine. The topic this morning will be the major environmental concerns of the nation with specific application to Kootenay West. So it sounds like we're going to get down to some real nuts and bolts local issues, which is always important. And progressive conservative environmental policy, as well as environmental law in general. This presentation will be followed by a question and answer period. Okay, thank you very much. Bob Brisco.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to, first of all, compliment and thank the organizers of this very worthwhile environmental conference. I understand, I only arrived here at 10 o'clock this morning, but I understand the previous speaker in one of the workshops dealing with environmental law was very interesting. I hope that before the day is out, I have an opportunity to speak with him. There are some sections of my address to you this morning which I had hoped would be more fully fleshed out because I left them right up to last evening. I make specific reference to the garrison diversion. The reasons for perhaps the lack of fully dealing with the garrison diversion will develop as I make my address to you. Hopefully, this will not bore you to tears, and hopefully I will finish in lots of time for questions and answers. December the 15th, 1976, the Liberian tanker Argo Merchant sinks off Nantucket Island, spilling 7.6 million gallons of oil. December the 17th, 76, the Liberian tanker Sansina blows up in Los Angeles Harbor, killing 9 and injuring 50. December 19th, 1976, the Panamanian tanker Grand Zenith is now believed lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean off the northeast coast of the United States with a loss of 38 crew members and a cargo of 8 million gallons of oil. December the 24th, 76, the Liberian tanker Oswego Peace leaks 2,000 gallons of oil into the Thames River at New London, Connecticut. December the 27th, 1976, the Liberian tanker Olympic Games leaks 133,500 gallons of crude oil into the Delaware River. December the 30th, 1976, the Liberian tanker Dauphine runs aground off Puerto Rico. January the 7th, 77, the Liberian tanker Marianne is rocked by an explosion. January the 31st, 77, the Liberian tanker Exotic explodes off the Moroccan coast. 6 crew members disappear. In a period of 1.5 months, in a sudden rash of tanker accidents, more than 15 million gallons of oil were dumped into the coastal waters off North America. The cost, both in terms of human life and environmental damage, which may take months, if not years, to fully calculate, let alone resolve, may be the price that had to be paid in order to awaken the general public to the potential and imminent ecological disaster which has been in the creaking and rusting hulls of ships using inadequate and outdated navigational aids and devices and manned by negligent and undertrained crews. As appalling as the news was coming from our coasts during the past couple of months, they are clear indications that this may only be a prelude to a far more serious catastrophe in the future. In the years since 1950, there has been a dramatic increase both in the number of ships and total tonnage of world shipping. Furthermore, this increase has been most marked in the area of oil tankers. With this tremendous increase in the volume of shipping, it is only natural that one asks what has been done to raise the safety performance of the vessels now plying the world's ocean routes. Well, there are a number of significant and important technical advances which can be pointed to, including double-bottom hulls, satellite navigational aids, twin screws and rudders, separate ballast storage, and a host of other improvements designed to cut down on marine accidents or at least limit the damage caused when one occurs. Unfortunately, only the most recently built ships have many of these safety features built in. In short, we have a situation in which we have seen a large-fold increase in the number of ships cruising our oceans, but have really not implemented to any really significant extent measures designed to control the increased traffic. Indeed, the introduction of the supertanker occurred, at least in the initial stage, without the acquired expertise necessary to foresee the ship's capabilities in adverse weather conditions, or even its normal lifespan. We have a situation today in which 150,000-ton tankers, which were built 10 to 12 years ago, are sailing off our coasts, and nobody is really sure what the effects have been of the constant stress and strain caused by differing water temperatures, pounding of waves, and shifting of cargo on their massive hulls. Nobody is really sure just when and if these original sea giants are going to break apart. Just as an aside, I would remind you of the history of the Liberty ships during the Second World War and the problems that they had with those particular hulls. However, one thing we can be sure of: if one of them does break up, we will not be measuring the resultant oil spills in terms of gallons, but rather in barrels. Returning to the list of ships lost at the end of last year, which I gave at the beginning of this speech, I think most everyone must have been struck by the nationality of the vessels involved. You don't have to be an old salt to realize that there have been and there is an increasing tendency for ships to sail under flags of nations not normally noted for their long maritime tradition. I referred to such countries as Libya, Panama, and Somalia. This relatively recent development in world shipping to register ships under what is commonly referred to as flags of convenience is beginning to have a major impact not only for marine underwriters and national governments, but also for environmentalists. Flags of convenience provide ship owners with a form of tax haven, which enables them to pay lower wages, provide fewer benefits to their crews, and escape the higher and more rigid shipping regulations and standards of most of the developed countries. A study published in July of '75 by H.P. Drury Limited of London, England, who are highly respected shipping consultants, clearly implies that flags of convenience ships are generally less adequately maintained and manned by less competent crews than those ships from the traditional maritime nations. As a result, we have a higher incidence of casualties. In the period 1970 to 74, which are the most recent figures that I was able to obtain, on the average, 21% of world gross registered tonnage was registered under flags of convenience. The same flags were responsible for 36% of the total losses. The H.P. Drury study states, and I quote, "Flags of convenience vessels do contribute to the world's accident record in a greater proportion than perhaps can be justified by the size of their fleets. Amongst the free flag fleets, there are marked differences between the amounts of tonnage lost. But in relation to the actual size of the fleets, the proportion lost is generally very considerable." Obviously, if the nations under which flags of convenience ships fly fail to implement safety standards, then those nations, such as Canada and the United States, in whose coastal waters these ships frequently ply, must seriously consider implementing measures which would protect their environment from potential marine disasters. To date, there has been absolutely no indication that the present federal government is intending to take any action along these lines. On the contrary, there seems to be an increase in the number of old, decrepit, outdated tubs employed in our coasting trade. Just this past week, some of my colleagues and myself had an opportunity of meeting with representatives of the Canadian Shipbuilding and Repairing Association. At this meeting, the matter of the rash of marine accidents at the end of the year was brought up, and the question of quality of ships was raised. One of the members of the association mentioned a conversation which he had had the day before with a certain individual who had just bought a vessel from a foreign country to use in the Canadian coasting trade. After an inspection, he found that it would have cost him $500,000 to bring this particular ship up to Canadian standards. Instead, he simply had the vessel registered in the Bahamas. It didn't cost him a cent, and today it is presently plying and operating in Canadian waters. This, I feel, is both appalling and unacceptable. Similarly unacceptable not only to Canada, to Canadians, but also apparently to the United States, is the fact that of the 600 vessels flying flags of convenience, 485, or 81.6%, are U.S. owned but foreign registered. I need not dwell on the reasons. As recently as 2 weeks ago, the United States Secretary of Transport stated, quote, that strict regulations for oil tanker traffic would be implemented for the protection of United States coastlines, including navigational aids to pinpoint a vessel's location within 50 feet. His comments prompted a series of questions in the House of Commons last week, led off by Bill Jarvis, which also prompted other questions by other Conservative members. And I would like to run through them because they are pertinent to what I have already said. Mr. Bill Jarvis, incidentally, is the Conservative critic of the environment. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Fisheries and the Environment and relates to a potential catastrophe caused by substandard oil tankers. In view of the fact that the new United States Transportation Secretary, Mr. Adams, announced on Tuesday stricter regulations of all tankers operating in U.S. waters, will the Minister advise this House whether he plans to announce similar or identical regulations for tankers operating in Canadian waters? What further concrete measures is the Minister prepared to take other than those announced by the Minister of Transport in the House on Tuesday last? He's referring to a question that was asked by the Minister of Transport with reference to control of ship traffic, and the Minister indicated that new radar devices were being implemented on both coasts. Romeo LeBlanc, the Minister of Fisheries and the Environment, replied, saying that under the Shipping Act, this is obviously the responsibility of my colleague, the Minister of Transport. However, we have discussed this matter with our officials, especially those dealing with pollution matters, at the Law of the Sea Conference, to see how international cooperation can advance faster than it has. Personally, I rejoice that the new United States Secretary of Transport is taking a more hawkish position on this issue. Mr. Jarvis, a supplementary question. Bearing in mind that if our standards are lower than those in the United States, we will inevitably find ill-equipped tankers diverted from U.S. ports to Canadian ports, is it the intention either of the Minister of the Environment or his colleague, the Minister of Transport, to engage in discussions with their United States counterparts in order that Canada and the United States can cooperate fully to ensure a common and comprehensive tanker regulation program? More preferably, would the Minister either directly or through his colleague, the Minister of Transport, make representations to Mr. Adams and ask for Canadian participation in the newly formed Marine Safety Task Force in the United States to protect our common interests? The Minister. It is obvious that in the matter of environmental protection, our two countries have been working very closely together. In fact, as the Honourable Member knows, even with the previous administration, there was a difference of opinion between the transportation interests and the environmental interests in the United States. As I say, I rejoice that the new Secretary of Transport is taking a more hawkish view on a more environmentalist view of this issue. I think that international cooperation and agreement on tough standards is, in the long run, the only solution, as it has always been in regulating transportation through the airways. For some reason, this mystical freedom of the high seas, which was really a freedom or rite of passage, has been extended to freedom to pollute. and I think every nation in the world must resist this movement. The minister's remarks were greeted with approbation. Mr. Jarvis, a final supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the minister's words, but I'm trying to find out when he is going to turn from a dove into a hawk himself, and whether the Minister of Transport is going to do something. If I may forget the non-answer, can I ask the Minister, with respect to Canadian waters, whether he will advise what plans exist for the enforcement of present and future regulations in Canadian waters within the 200-mile limit, so that accidents such as we have been experiencing lately will be at least minimized along our coastline? The Minister responded by saying that the extension of the jurisdiction to 200 miles is an extension of fisheries jurisdiction. Whether or not, eventually, as a result of the Law of the Sea Conference going one way or the other, the nations will declare this type of jurisdiction for the protection of their coastlines remains open. Following that, there were questions addressed to the Minister with reference to the installation of radar sites on the coast of Juan de Fuca in cooperation and in coordination with the United States. There was a question with reference to the possibility of prohibiting tankers from entering the Parry Sound harbor because of the possibility of a spill there and the fact that there had already been on record a spill. And there was a question regarding the provision for boarding of tankers within the 200-mile zone and government action be taken. I think it can be said that it is our duty to see that similar standards and an accord are shared with the United States. Now, this brings me to an area of more immediate geographic concern, and I refer to the Valdez Arm and to the Douglas Channel and Kitimat. Valdez Arm, leading into the port of Valdez, has some very disturbing features. Heavy snowfalls that severely restrict visibility in the winter months, torrential rainfalls in the spring and fall, high winds, and a narrow, curving entrance as a tanker enters the Narrows after leaving the port, laden with oil, and the first problem that tanker meets is a large rock about a third out from the starboard shore, a critical navigational hazard. Now, how would the shipmaster cope with this particular obstruction? Using a tanker simulator in Holland, modeled after flight simulators used in commercial airline flight training, experienced supertanker masters were required to steer a tanker through the Valdez Narrows. Because of the severe and varied weather conditions in the Valdez area, the simulator was able to feed in these particular conditions of wind, of rain and snow, etc. Now, what were the results? Out of 130 runs on the simulator, tankers ended up on the rocks on the opposite shore to the obstruction to which I referred about 50% of the time. In most cases, the masters were overcompensating for the rock obstruction at the entrance to the Narrows. This scarcely augurs well for the immediate future when we move from simulation to reality. Digressing for a moment from the usual flags of convenience, it should be noted that another group of nations are also moving into this field of flags of convenience, and I refer to the emerging third world countries, particularly on the African continent. These countries are buying up old ships in order to move their raw materials. Their often shaky financial status prevents the purchase or construction of new vessels. And I fear that from an environmental standpoint, this is only the tip of the iceberg. The acceleration of the industrial economy in these countries may well be on the basic idea and philosophy of development at any cost, with little concern for the effects and the end results. Moving down the coast, we come to the Kitimat proposal. Now, how will the tanker arrive? Will it remain west of the Charlottes, swinging around their southern tip and thence into the Douglas Channel? Or will it travel by way of the Dixon entrance to the north of the Charlottes and into the more protective waters of Hecate Straits, with its heavier sea traffic, unpredictable currents, and the graveyard of many ships? What of the pipeline itself? There are two immediate proposals. One is to follow the highway to Smithers. Now that's a very good idea. But the highway closely follows the Skeena and its enormous spawning capacity. Now it's true that a pipeline break would be more rapidly identified and more accessible for repair. But in the meantime, the question has to be asked how much oil will slip into the Skeena River. A second proposal would have the pipeline follow the existing gas line. Now that's not a bad idea. After all, the ground has already been turfed up and the line is already in place, and it simply means that we follow the same route and twin the lines. The problem is that the terrain is very steep, and the line would cross some very important creeks feeding the Skeena River. A washout above or at one of these creeks, such as occurred with the gas line itself, would dump a mile or a mile and a half of oil from the pipeline just by simple gravity on this steep terrain into one of these creeks with disastrous results. Other effects of oil spills in the Douglas Channel itself would seriously damage winter shoreline feeding areas for deer, moose, coyote, and wolf, not to mention damage to all forms of marine life. If there is to be a Kitimat pipeline, the concerns I have remarked upon must be given most serious consideration. As the issue now stands, an application is being made before the National Energy Board, and with all probability the report of the National Energy Board will not be made public prior to the NEB bringing down a decision. Further, the NEB will not consider anything beyond the pipeline. Docking, storage facilities, tanker routes, and so on are beyond the jurisdiction of the board. I think all these points are worthy of very serious consideration. And I note, as an aside, on the radio this morning that Iona Campanola has indicated that there will be public hearings throughout the province with reference to the proposed Kitimat pipeline. That's an encouraging disclosure. Since we are on the Pacific coast, I think it would be appropriate at this time to touch on the Ocean Dumping Act, Bill C-37. While this bill does not deal specifically with tanker spills, it is germane to environmental concerns and pollution. The bill is defined as an act to provide for the control of the dumping of waste and other substances into the ocean. And if I may, I have excerpted from this bill some rather key segments or regulations. Dumping means any deliberate disposal from ships, aircraft, platforms, or other man-made structures at sea of any substance, but does not include A, any disposal that is incidental to or derived from the normal operations of a ship or an aircraft, or of any equipment thereof, other than the disposal of substances from a ship or aircraft operated for the purpose of disposing of such substances at sea. And B, any discharge that is incidental to or derived from the exploration for, exploitation of, and associated offshore processing of seabed mineral resources. The sea is defined, for the purposes of this Act, A, the territorial seas of Canada, B, the internal waters of Canada other than inland waters, C, any fishing zones prescribed pursuant to the Territorial Sea and Fishing Zone Act, and D, the Arctic waters within the meaning of the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. There is also another area, any area of the sea other than the internal waters of a foreign state, not included in the areas of the sea referred to above. There is also provision within this Act to prevent the deliberate disposal from ships or aircraft or platforms, etc., of any substance by incineration or other means of thermal degradation deemed to be dumping. There is control in this bill for the loading of ships. No person shall load on any ship or aircraft in Canada for the purpose of dumping any substance except in accordance with the terms and conditions of the permit that would be issued for such dumping. There is provision in here to prevent a sea captain from taking aboard items to be dumped in the ocean off our waters from some foreign port. There is also provision with reference to the disposal of any substance at sea by placing it on ice. There is provision to cover the circumstances of an emergency. However, the bill goes on to state that nothing in this section relieves any person of his liability under this act if the danger to human life or any ship or aircraft that gave rise to dumping under the authority of subsection 1, which is the emergency, was caused by a negligent act or omission of such person. It is the duty of every vessel to report any dumping. No permit may be granted in respect of a substance specified in Schedule 1 unless, in the opinion of the minister, the substance is rapidly rendered harmless by physical, chemical, or biological process of the sea and does not render normally edible marine organisms inedible, unpalatable, or endanger human health or the health of animals. With respect to any substance specified in this schedule, such substance is contained in another substance in a quantity or concentration that does not exceed the maximum quantity or concentration prescribed. I think it should be noted that within this ocean dumping bill, terms of a permit are spelled out. It should also be noted that publication is required in the Canada Gazette before dumping. And it should also be noted that in this bill there is provision for complaints from the public, where the minister receives complaints from members of the public in respect of A, the granting of a permit or any terms and conditions thereof, or B, any variation of the terms and conditions of the permit. The minister may, if he deems it advisable, establish a board and may refer any or all such complaints to the board. Now, what about the penalties? For dumping or loading in contravention of the permit on summary conviction, a fine not exceeding $100,000 where the offense involves a substance in Schedule 1, $75,000 Schedule 2, $50,000 where the offense involves any substance not specified in either of these schedules. These provisions also apply to aircraft and other means of dumping. I think perhaps since Schedule 1 is relatively brief, I can deal with that. These are the prohibited substances: organohalogen compounds, mercury and mercury compounds, cadmium and cadmium compounds, persistent plastics and other persistent synthetic materials, crude oil, fuel oil, diesel oil, lubricating oils, hydraulic fluids, and any mixture containing any of them, high-level radioactive wastes or other high-level radioactive matter that may be prescribed, substances in whatever form produced for biological and chemical warfare. Now, those are totally prohibited items. Schedule 2 contains a short list of restricted substances which are subject to rigid control: arsenic and its compounds, lead, copper, zinc, cyanides, fluorides, pesticides, beryllium, chromium, nickel, vanadium, containers and scrap metal, radioactive wastes or other radioactive material not included in Schedule 1, and substances that by reason of their bulk would interfere with shipping. Schedule 3 contains factors to be taken into account in granting permits. Now, I won't read them, but I would give you the titles: the characteristics and composition of the substance, the characteristics of the dumping site and the method of deposit, the bottom characteristics, for example. Then there are a list of general conditions which principally concern marine life. Now, that's a very comprehensive bill. I serve on the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Fisheries. Or the department has been very lax. And those are determinations that I intend to make within the next few weeks. Another noteworthy environmental concern is the garrison diversion. My remarks concerning this issue are of a general nature, for in truth, I have not had the opportunity to be fully informed on this subject. I would like to add, however, that last week, Dean Whiteway, Conservative member for Selkirk, Manitoba, in a rarely offered honor, addressed a session of the state legislature of North Dakota on the subject of the garrison diversion. He expressed the concerns of Canadians, of Manitobians, and was frank and sincere. He was, according to the reports that I have received, very well received. Funding of the garrison diversion in North Dakota has continued, despite repeated statements that no final decision has been reached on the project. I think, as an aside comment, it should be noted that the Prime Minister has apparently on his agenda discussions with reference to the Garrison River project. As you are no doubt aware, drainage from the salt, pesticide, and fertilizer-riddled soil through which the diverted water will flow will drain into Manitoba and eventually into Lake Winnipeg, not to mention the ongoing effect on the Nelson Basin and points much further north. Canadian authorities have been aware of the Garrison Diversion Unit proposal since its inception in 1957. It was not until the 1970s that any action was taken, and Canada frankly stopped wringing its hands. An intensive report on the effects of the project was published in 1974, outlining in detail the potential problems and moves made to curtail the completion of the Lone Tree Reservoir. I personally feel that regardless of the contents of the final report being published by the IJC, supposedly in June of this year, there will be little we can do to prevent the final stages of construction. The only alternative that I can see is a push to ensure that the canals are lined adequately and filter mechanisms employed on the Missouri River. Now, two important features associated with water diversion are water quality and flooding. In the Garrison Diversion Unit, it appears that sulfate will have the most serious impact on water quality if the irrigation plan is implemented and will exceed water quality objectives most of the time in the Souris River, the Assiniboine, and the Red. The effect would be most pronounced during periods of low flow. Thus, there would be increased water processing costs in order to produce water of acceptable quality for domestic and industrial use. There would also be an expected increase in nitrate nitrogen in the whole system, with additional algae growth, attendant water conditioning problems, restricted recreational opportunities, not to mention the harm to the fishery. Calculation of annual flood day averages shows a marked increase, and the expected increased flooding costs would be $24,000 per year. This probably does not incidentally take into consideration the $7.5 million required to upgrade the Souris and Portage water systems to handle the overflow. It is noticeable that costs will exceed any benefits we might gain from the project. A similar lesson can be learned by referring to the Kootenay River diversion. Under the Columbia River Treaty, ratified in 1964, and I quote, "Canada has the right, after the expiration of 20 years from the ratification date, to divert not more than 1.5 million acre-feet of water a year from the Kootenay River in the vicinity of Canal Flats to the headwaters of the Columbia, provided that the diversion does not produce the flow of the Kootenay River immediately downstream from the point of diversion below the lesser of 200 cubic feet per second or the natural flow," unquote. This means the water destined for the Libby Dam could give BC extra power to the amount of 820 million kilowatt hours. It also means there could be significant environmental problems caused by higher water levels on the Columbia between Canal Flats and Golden, and by lower levels downstream on the Kootenay. As an aside to that, one of the concerns that has developed in the studies that have been undertaken in the Canal Flats area is the fact that there is a possibility that with a dropping of the water level of the Kootenay River, what you will have in effect is a suction type of problem through the subsoil, which could possibly drain Wassa Lake. That's a point that they had not considered, but it's just like pulling the plug on the wash basin. A study presently being conducted by BC Hydro is in its first stages. I had a look at this study initiated in 1975 and feel, one, that the study area is too restrictive, and two, not enough attention has been given to the long-range effects of the environmental problems, particularly in our area, that this will create. As it stands now, the study area encompasses a strip of land extending from a few miles north of the 49th parallel to a few miles north of Golden, a distance of approximately 200 miles long, 40 miles wide. Because nutrient loading has increased in Kootenay Lake, in light of the fact that construction of the Libby Dam changed the patterns of water circulation in the lake, there is the possibility that certain mixtures of nutrients could result in eutrophication of the lake in subsequent algae growth. This, of course, could well affect water quality. Now, to expand on these comments, I inquired about the federal study now being conducted on Kootenay Lake by the Federal Department of Environment Canada. The response from the Deputy Minister is as follows. Sorry about that. He said, to respond to the questions you raised at the Standing Committee meeting of Fisheries and Forestry on December the 2nd. With regard to the study on Kootenay Lake, you asked why it was or is being done. First, the study of Kootenay Lake limnology was initiated by this department in April 1976 and is scheduled for 2 years of field activity, followed by 1 year of data interpretation and report preparation. The purpose of the study is to assess the effects of the altered natural pattern of flows into Kootenay Lake, which resulted from completion of the Libby Dam on the Kootenay River in Montana, and to a lesser extent of the Duncan Dam on the Duncan River in BC. The decrease in freshet flows and the increase in winter flows will have definite effects on the limnology of the lake, including physical circulation, thermal characteristics, turbidity, chemistry, and microbiology. These factors, as well as the input of pollutants, will be assessed. The study will also attempt to obtain the basic information and understanding necessary to assess future water management alternatives, including the potential for future diversion in Canada of the upper Kootenay River into the headwaters of the Columbia River and possible changes in the method of lake operation. This study was not initiated as a result of the recent interest of the provincial government in the Kootenay River diversion at Canal Flats, but as noted above, should provide information which will help to evaluate the effects the diversion would have on the lake. In response to your question concerning federal involvement in examining the questions of the Kootenay River diversion, our only direct involvement is through our Canadian Wildlife Service. It is currently gathering basic ecological information to assess the possible impact of the diversion on wildlife resources. Signed by Mr. Seaborn, Deputy Minister of Fisheries and Environment Canada. It is probably a pertinent time to mention another matter that has generated quite a bit of correspondence in the last few months, and this is the Asarco copper-silver mine proposal for Troy, Montana, and the resultant effects on the Kootenay River system. The mine I've received a lot of mail on the subject and certainly discussions with constituents. I provided the detailed information from the mine to an independent source and asked for an appraisal. The response was that the mine will apparently not contact any iron sulfides and should therefore be a clean operation with no acid mine water problems. There should be no acid and heavy metal contamination of any natural waterways, and the indicated seepage from the tailing pond will be diluted 7,000 times by the Kootenay River normally and 1,100 times at the lowest flow yet recorded. This dilution, plus the high quality of the indicated seepage, should prevent any deterioration of water quality in the Kootenay River system. Although the evidence is encouraging, an ongoing monitoring process should continue. This mine, of course, is not yet in production. On an immediately local level, I draw your attention to a press release from my office dated May 1976. At that time, I released details of a plan to make the BC forest industry hopefully more self-sufficient in energy. Quote, "The forest product industry wastes over half of the bark, wood, chippings, and sawdust produced as a result of its operations. There is a tremendous energy potential in the surplus wood waste, known in the industry as hog fuel. For example, in 1973, hog fuel in the equivalent of 17 million barrels of oil, or 20 days' worth of imports at 1976 rates, was wasted either by burning it in incinerators or burying it as landfill. Under present tax laws, there is, particularly to the more marginal operators in the industry, a disincentive to process wood waste into a form usable as fuel. The income tax regulations currently in force allow for a very slow rate of depreciation in the case of equipment necessary to process and burn hog fuel. Now, as a result of this and an accompanying brief, a research paper which was presented to the Minister of Finance, to the Minister of Energy, and also to the Minister of Revenue. The Minister of Finance, while not alluding to his information source, and doubtless after having his department verify the research material, and I should state that the bulk of that research material dealing with hog fuel was done for me by a graduate of Notre Dame, Barnum Klug. So I think he certainly deserves a credit line. He did the guts of the work, and it speaks well for Notre Dame. But as a result of this research paper, the government implemented a special provision for tax write-offs to industry that would implement procedures to utilize hog fuel rather than to burn off non-renewable fuel. Now, it is also my understanding that KFP here locally has engaged a consulting engineer for the purpose of adopting some form of wood waste utilization for power generation, and I am pleased that such a project would be contemplated in my own riding. Another noteworthy piece of legislation which is now law and which passed through the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Fisheries and Forestry is the Environmental Contaminants Act. Bill C-25 passed by Parliament in October 75, and it appears that the terms and regulations are being enforced. However, it is again unusual that no one has apparently violated this act, as no charges have been laid. The key elements of the bill, and ones that I think are of interest to you, are the fact that the Minister and the Minister of National Health and Welfare may jointly appoint advisory committees to review any data collected pursuant to this Act, to receive representations from interested parties or concerned members of the public, and to advise the Minister and the Minister of National Health and Welfare respecting measures to control the presence in the environment of any substance or class of substance. Where during a calendar year a person manufactures or imports a chemical compound in excess of 500 kilograms, and he manufactures or imports that compound in excess of that quantity for the first time, he shall, within 3 months of manufacturing or importing the said quantity, notify the Minister of the name of the compound, the quantity manufactured or imported during that year, and of any information in his possession respecting any danger to health, the environment posed by this compound. I'm wondering whether this particular advisory committee to which the bill refers is the vehicle by which the Minister himself, the Minister of Health, has appointed an independent group to look into the arsenic problem at Yellowknife. And that's a determination that I think will be made next week in the House of Commons. The provisions for offenses under this Act and the requirements for reporting are just as rigid as they were in the Ocean Dumping Act. As an aid to environmental policy, and in conclusion, which is always a couple of great words for people to hear, think one of the most important areas of any government policy or any party's policy is accessibility with reference to environmental concerns by the public, to have some vehicle by which you or I can have access to particular environmental concerns and be able to express them. One of the policy platforms that was spelled out in 1974 by the Conservatives was to create or establish an Environmental Council of Canada, independent of government, to advise the government and the public and recommend measures for pollution abatement and environmental protection. The Council will be charged with the responsibilities and be given the necessary funding and facilities to define problems, both short and long term, to recommend solutions, and to especially concern itself with the problems inherent in the proper balance between necessary resource development and the protection and conservation of the environment. The Council will have the power by legislation to hold public hearings and will file annually a Canada Environment Report. It is through the medium of an Environmental Council that the general public will have access to and the provision for input on matters of local, regional, or national environmental concern. Now, there are many other specific areas covered in our environmental policy, but looking at my watch, the constraints of time do not allow me to expand on them, but I can provide this information for you on request. I would like to also comment that I notice in the front row, and not because he's here, I would have said it even if he hadn't been here, that we have Dennis Stanley from the Arrow Lakes News. And I'm sure many of you followed the editorials that were written by Dennis in the past few months with reference to the Revelstoke Dam. I think the depth of his research and the depth of his concern have been clearly spelled out to those who have read his articles, and I think he is to be most sincerely complimented for his efforts on our behalf. Thank you, Dennis. Now, I know that if you had the backsides that could withstand it, that probably we could cover a lot of other environmental concerns at the federal level. But I think it would be appropriate at this time to field some questions if you have any, and if not, to give you an opportunity to have a coffee break or whatever. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Two questions. What's your policy on Public Disclosure Act? Will the Conservative Party, if they're elected, form a government, come out with a Public Disclosure Act that makes information available to the public as a right by law?
Well, sir, I'd like to think that that question was staged and that we'd arranged it beforehand, because the proponent of such disclosures and the strongest opposition to government secrecy has been initiated by Jed Baldwin, Conservative member for Peace River. He has sought the assistance of public interest groups across Canada to assist him in dealing with this very issue. And he's the mastermind behind that.
Yeah. But part of the problem there is the gap between opposition and government is extremely wide. And application of opposition statements, and when they become government, leaves much to be desired. And I hope that that's not a problem you people face when you get there. I have another question.
No, I don't think we'd have any difficulty with that particular thing at all. I'm sure that many people are aware of the fact that supposedly secret federal government documents are available in the United States through Congress. Yeah. They have the information, you just have to write and ask for them, and we have no difficulty with that particular area of concern.
Okay, the next question. Your government, or your party, is very concerned about the anti-inflation control programs, as everybody else is. How do we marry some kind of an increase in productivity as far as people are concerned to some kind of a limit to growth syndrome that brings us somewhere within the balance of what we can produce, maintain a state of equilibrium, and still keep people positively employed in something or other?
Well, that's a pretty big question, but and I don't quite see the reference to the AIB other than the reference has been made that the AIB has helped to reduce increases in production or hold back increases in production and development. But when you get into a question of economics and you talk about the balance of industry versus population growth and so on, you're getting into a very heavy subject, and quite frankly one that I am not qualified to comment on. There's no point in giving you a snow job. Anybody else? Yes, sir? Can you give me a second? This is Bill C-236. It was submitted for first reading on the 22nd of October, 76. It's a private member's bill, and it was put before the House and drafted by Bob Wenman, Conservative member from Fraser Valley West, and Vice Chairman to Bill Jarvis, our environmental critic. The bill is an act to protect the Canadian environment by instituting mandatory impact assessment procedures prior to the construction of installations potentially damaging to the environment. Now that's the short subtitle. But the bill is some 13 pages long and deals in depth with the issues that you have raised. And just for a second, I'll give you the interpretation or definitions. In this act, air includes enclosed air. Department means the Department of the Environment. And environment means 1, air, land, or water, plant and animal life, including humans, social, economic, and cultural conditions that influence the life of humans or a community, any building, structure, machine, or other device or thing made by humans, any solid, liquid, gas, odor, heat, sound, vibration, or radiation resulting directly or indirectly from the activities of humans, or, and so on and on. And it's a very comprehensive bill. It's very rigid. And I would be very surprised if the bill passed, because, as I say, it's submitted by the opposition. It's a private member's bill. Lorne Nicholson could tell you all about that. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be the first time that governments have taken or lifted what they consider to be the portions of a bill that they can live with, drafted it into their own legislation, and resubmitted it. Now, if that happens, that's fine. We've done our job, and Wenman will have his own personal satisfaction that he initiated that.
Would such a bill be applied to provincial projects also, for example, hydro projects?
Well, it would be up to the province to. It would be up to the province to introduce that type of legislation. It would also be up to. I shouldn't say also. It would be encouraging to see the provinces and the federal government coordinate their environmental legislation, because it's a dog's breakfast. Yes, Lorne.
Yes, Bob, in reading the crude oil supply alternatives for the Northern Tier States Federal Energy Administration, I came across something the other day on a U.S.-Canadian pipeline treaty. Negotiating teams of both countries initialed a draft of a new treaty, which has its 2 objectives. Number 1, to assure the non-discriminatory treatment of hydrocarbons owned by either nation flowing through pipelines of the other, and number 2, to assure the throughput in such a way that neither country could arbitrarily cut off deliveries of hydrocarbons to the other. Have you been privy to any further details of this in Ottawa? And do you have any comments?
Well, that's sure. I would think that that's a major political concern of the United States, that we in, let's say, the emergency that they have experienced in the southeastern United States were to occur in eastern Canada, and we ran into a shortage. They would certainly be very concerned that we might shut off the tap. It is a concern that has been voiced in a general way. Lauren, I'm not privy to discussions that have occurred within my own caucus on it. I don't serve on the Energy Caucus. But it's certainly a concept that has been raised on more than one occasion. That's the most enlightening remarks I can make on that point. Anybody else?
Bob, in reference to the fact that a great deal of development that's going to occur in Canada is going to be carried out both if it's going to occur in say, in the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline or the Kitimat Pipeline or items such as this, the major firms carrying out such development will probably be American corporations or a consortium of American corporations. Is there anything under the Foreign Investment Review Act that could prohibit the investment of multi-millions worth of dollars in projects that would be environmentally and socially detrimental to peoples living along the British Columbia coast or to Native peoples living in the Northwest Territories? And that's one question. And the second question is, what is the position of the Conservative Party on the Dean Declaration of Land Claims in the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline area? I'd be interested in hearing your remarks on that.
I didn't get the one word were you saying the Denny Declaration?
Like the Denny Declaration of land claims that they claim should be settled before the building of any major pipeline in the north. And I'm curious, that declaration has been presented to the Liberal government, and I'm curious what the Conservatives Party response has been to that, as well as to my first question.
Right. Well, let me answer the second question first, because I'm going to come back to you again on the first question. There are one or two points I'd like you to clarify on question one. But with reference to the second question, only recently, I think last week, you may have noticed that there was an exchange going on between Warren Almond and Alistair Gillespie on that point. Now, Warren Almond said there being nothing done with reference to the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline or other pipeline proposals until native land claims have been settled. Alistair Gillespie took the other tack and said that he felt that the pipeline could proceed without the native land claims being settled. The Conservative Caucus on Indian Affairs ascribes to the view at this stage that the preliminary surveys can be done, that the environmental studies principally have been done, that only the preliminary surveys, but not the actual construction, should be implemented with reference to the pipeline before land claims are settled. As